Without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister.
Can you repeat, please?
Now we can start, and without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to open the speech.
Thank you very much, dear Speaker. This House supports job security legislation because it's mutually beneficial for employees, employers, and the government. So originally, the job security measures was invented by employers in order to protect employees and give them better opportunities, and in this way they can hire better better heads, better more qualified people, because this protection gives them more security. And for employees it's obviously beneficial, because in case of they lose the job, they will receive some money, and this will protect them. This will make their life more stable, and for that money which they receive, they can find another job. So basically they feel themselves more secure, and in the long term, between employers and employers, this legislation creates mutually beneficial relationship. So employee wouldn't leave this company by his own will, because if he leaves this company by his own will, he wouldn't receive bonuses, for example, severance payment. And employer wouldn't be willing to fire this employee, because he will lose money with that. So employers are interested in long-term relationships, and employers are interested, and this will lead to better choosing and selection of employers. So companies will make test periods, they will make additional interviews in order to select people who is really want to work on this job, who is fitting well, and they are sure that this worker wouldn't leave very fast. This is good for economy, because it's like reduce instability and makes business more predictable. And when business is predictable, like this value is its cost is higher, and it's good for government. So that's why we as government support this legislation, because we like social stability. So we don't like strikes, which can be initiated by worker unions, because they can do it in case the work conditions will be bad. And another benefit for government is we can pay less welfare for unemployed people, because partially this welfare will be compensated by the companies by this severance payment. And the same we can say about retirement. Like when people are retired by the company, they receive additional money, so they're more protected socially. So basically, companies will partially take care of social security, and they will additionally increase it, additionally protect our citizens. So for everyone, this is beneficial. So it creates, maybe a position will say that it creates problem for employers if they hire a wrong worker, and they will need to pay like the payment. But there is ways to solve this problem. First of all, this legislation will like still imply some ways to fire the really bad worker who missing job, for example, for a long period of time, but you should have good reason to fire him. So there is no problems for employers, for companies with such workers. But other problems like with retirement, with firing, can be solved if companies will give more attention to people who they hire, if they will like take additional interviews, test periods, if they spend more time before hiring the employee. So basically, we support this motion because of social stability and because it's beneficial for employers, employees, and the government. Thank you very much.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech and would like to invite the leader of opposition. Here.
Thank you, Speaker. Can everyone please just tell me if I'm clear, if I'm being heard clearly? And then afterwards I'll start. Thank you so much. So beginning with what the leader of the government said, he mentioned that supporting these laws of legislation will provide stability and will make business predictable. But he failed to mention that how it will make businesses predictable. I will just offer some counters to his propositions, and then I'll move forward to my argument. First of all, we should assume we are debating this in a society where the companies and everything is run on free market ideology. So private companies are driven by ambitions and competitions. If companies will assume the role of government by paying people, by paying their employees, I fail to see how that would incentivize companies to pay them higher wages, or I fail to see how that will incentivize the governments, the companies, private companies, if they are paying everyone this, if they are supposed to pay everyone, if they are not able to fire employees, how they'll be able to pay everyone. They are not going to pay them any higher wages, and it will inevitably lead to inflation, and it will inevitably lead to stagnation of the wages as well. So the point of the stability does not, to me, does not stand very firmly. Now, I would like to offer my arguments from two perspectives. First, from the perspective of the government. From the perspective of the government by enacting these laws is trying to shift their responsibilities on private enterprises. These leads to two main things. First, government is infringing their right to take decisions, which will ultimately benefit to the government itself as it will increase the productivity of the nation, because if they're able to if they're able to make their own decisions, then they will leave, then they will move towards a further technicalization of their companies, and they will increase the mechanical means of production, which will ultimately benefit the economy and its people as well. Secondly, we live in a time where increased technocracy and technological revolution has made this idea inevitable that people are going to get fired. And that's why the whole idea of universal basic income has been so popular, because it needs to be remembered that the idea of the universal basic income does not apply to the private companies, rather it applies to the government. And it's the job of the government, because they're taking taxes, because people are providing the government has the responsibility to provide back to the people. It is the responsibility to create jobs, and it has the responsibilities to create to incentivize individuals to be more skilled and to create those kinds of opportunities which will provide for the general population, instead of shifting the burden of responsibilities on the companies. From a second perspective, individual skills. So these policies, these laws are detrimental to individual skills as well, because if these laws are not in place, then this provides an opportunity for individuals and incentivizes them to acquire more skills and to be counted as more skilled labor. And this creates a sense of competition in the society. If we take out this element, and if we let companies pay for the unskilled labor as well, then it will again cause inflation and stagnation in the society again, and it will also cause a stagnation of skills as well. And furthermore, there are many industries which are rapidly and dynamically changing. So if a person, let's say, if a person is working in an IT job, and if he works on an outdated program, then he will be of no use to the company. The company would still have to pay for them, while the requirement of the digital world is increasing rapidly. If the government argues that the unemployment will rise, then it should be also noted that unemployment to a certain level, to a minimum level, is necessary to allow people to mobilize socially. If there is complete low unemployment, or if there is no unemployment, then there will be no social mobility in the society as well. And if everyone has a job, then it will lead to job inflation and stagnation of the wages. And thirdly, what about the new people? What about the generation who is acquiring, who is working hard? What about the individuals who are more working hardly to acquire new skills and to be more apt for the job? Where will they find the places if these laws are enacted? So I believe that in the absence of these laws, a demand of competition is increased, and which ultimately drives the society. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech, and would like to invite Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, everyone. I want to debate that leader of opposition thought that this motion put off the all individuals' skills, but it's all young women and old generation lose their skills after this motion. But it's not true, because they should have and should show to the employers that they better than others workers in a short testing time, and it's makes them learning harder because they should be more conquire, more compatible than other workers for employees. Because employees makes protectable work jobs, protectable working place, and they would taste everyone properly and for longer time. This motion doesn't decrease technological process because if people should prepare better for tasting time, they should learn the newest cutting-edge technologies, and technologies brings economic benefits for any business, even if business should cover working should cover firing, paying for firing workers. Should pay severance pay. When people would know that they may work in a, they should compete for such, you know, a fine piece of pie of a kind of work, they would compete with each other, with each other workers pretty hard. And even now, for hottest and more securable places, sometimes employees have 100 potential heads for one place. And in this situation, they take only sometimes 10 or few people from these 100 heads and test them for time, only 10 of them. And it brings really cool competition surrounding for worker and for employees. It brings best of the best for such place. And if they would want to work if they would to be highlighted by the worker, they would wish to show to employees that they have noticeable knowledge about this kind of work, and this destroyed any talk about stagnation because it brings pretty high competition about work place. People would gonna work better when they know, and they wouldn't leave their kind of job if they knew that it's fine, secure place, and people tend to work better if they have to think only about job, not about what they have to do if they firing. People and companies will provide better companies will have better communication with workers' community when they provide better workplace. And it's secure companies from strikes, from different employees of communities. Companies at the same time can change workers' position instead of firing. They can have to overpay for firing. They can just move them in a leader of structure in the company.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech and would like to invite Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi.
Sorry. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So our case rests on one main important principle, which is going to show that this theory is going to be detrimental, not only for the employees who are looking for a job, but also for employees who are already in a job. It is going to be also detrimental for the government, and it is also going to be problematic for the employers. So all the actors are going to be it's going to be problematic for all the actors that are involved in this motion, and I'm going to show you how. So the main principle is that because companies know that they are going to have to pay to are going to have less flexibility in firing people. So they know that the employees they are going to hire, they will have to keep them even in times of crisis, and they will have to bear heavy losses if during recessions or during times of crisis. So therefore companies are going to be, because of this protective measure, companies are going to be conservative. Companies are going to be less likely to hire more people because it is going because of the losses which they are going to have to bear during times of crisis. And as we know that global markets are experiencing a crisis every 5 to 10 years, and it's a major crisis when companies have to review their entire process, labor employees, which to keep and which to fire. So so any policy that a company is going to make is going to involve this. They are going to keep in mind these times of recessions and these times of crisis. So when they are going to consider hiring a person, they are going to consider is he absolutely necessary. So because of this protective measure, they're actually going to the companies are going to become very conservative. Now, why is this very problematic for all the actors involved in this entire in this motion? Firstly, the company is going to hire less employees. So this creates more unemployment. Rather than decreasing unemployment, it actually creates more unemployment because they are hiring less people. So this is problematic for the people who are looking for a job, because companies are less likely to employ them. So this is very problematic for let's say migrants who are looking for a job, immigrants who are looking for a job, students who are looking for a job, because they know companies are very less likely to hire people, because it's difficult. Because of this protective measure, they can't easily dispose of new employees. The second problem is going to be that because of this protective measure, it is going to be detrimental to people who are already in a job, and they have this protective measure in place for them, this job security in place for them. Why? Because because they are hiring less new employees, they are going to place more work burden on these current employees who have the job security, and so they are going to be exploited more, with more working hours and more work burden on these employees who have the job security. And these employees who are being exploited within their job security, they are exploited with more work burden. They are going to be unable to leave their job easily, because they know that here in this company they have job security, but once they leave this company, they terminate their contract, they are going to find it very difficult to find a job elsewhere, because other companies as well are less likely to hire more people, hire other people. So it is going to be very difficult for these people who have a job to escape this exploitative tendency of their firm because of this protective measure. Thirdly, so after showing that this is going to be detrimental for both the employees who are for laborers who are looking for a job and laborers who already have a job, now I'm going to move on to the next actor in this motion, which is the employers themselves, the companies. It is going to be problematic for companies themselves. Why? Because this creates a very big inflexibility. They don't have the flexibility now during the times of crisis what to do. So they have to bear a greater burden on themselves, and which is problematic. So now they have to displace, because they have to pay their employees even during times of crisis. They need to find some place where to place this increased cost somewhere, and this is going to, in the end, it is going to exploit someone or the other. So what happens in the end is, it has been experienced in several countries where this has actually caused reduced wages, because the companies, what they do is, when they're hiring and they're providing such job security, what they automatically do is they shift the burden of the cost of firing on the employees themselves. So this in the end, it leads to reduced wages for employees, and the employers themselves find themselves in an inflexible position, because eventually they may have to like time and again, companies actually need to review their situation. So they should be able to have the flexibility to whom to keep and whom to fire, because of an increase in competency in the competitive markets. And it is problematic for the government as well, because as I mentioned, it is going to create greater unemployment in the market, because of these protective measures. Companies are less likely to hire people, which increases the unemployment rate, and this unemployment rate is actually problematic for the government, because now it has to itself create more jobs for the people, rather than companies being flexible and hiring more people and keeping and having a regular flow and outflow and inflow of people. People are going to be jobless for longer periods of time and find it more difficult. So the government will have to, the burden is going to be on the government to create new jobs. So as I've and this is also my last point is that this is going to screw up the millennial generation furthermore, because of the boomer generation. So the elder generation is going to find it more easy to sustain their jobs, and the millennial generation, who is already struggling in finding jobs, because of this protective measure, the companies are less likely to hire them, and which creates more difficulty for them. And
Time's up.
Okay, thank you.
We thank speaker for a fine speech, and to start second half, I would like to invite member of government. You're here.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, let's start. First of all, the opposition says that companies will be less likely to hire more people. Actually, that's simply not true. Why? Because we probably understand that companies, they still need their work done, and they need people to do this work. They cannot just spread all of the tasks between like 5 people and deal with it. No, they still need new people. They still need to spread something and delegate information. Well, from this derives the first point of our case. Because when we have this motion, the companies and the employers themselves, they understand that it will be much more difficult to fire the people they hire for work, because they will need some legitimate explanations, and the reasons must be serious for that. And thus they understand that they just need to hire the people who can do their work best. And that's why the best motivation for them is to increase the job requirements and make, for example, more interviews and more testing of the new employers and stuff like that, because they understand that they still need to hire people, and these people should be really productive for them to stay in this business and do their work decently, because they understand that firing them will be much more difficult when we have this motion. And from that derives the following: that people will be more compatible, and people will be more prepared for the work they want. They will study harder, they will read all the requirements and do their best to suit the needs of the company, because the company will set much more requirements because they need a productive worker. And because you want the job, no, thank you. Because you want the job is, and that's why you will be, you will prepare more for simply the job you want. And as a result, we will have more productive workers, and we will have, and productive workers means they receive more money, and that the products they do will be better. And that's why the companies will be more likely to prosper in future. The second point of our case is the transparency, because when we do not have these motions, the companies and the employers, they don't feel obliged to explain the reasons why they fire a particular person, because they are the bosses and they care about their business, not about the stuff and the consequences for the person they fire. Yes, they can explain that, like, we fired you because you didn't do that job, or for example, you missed that point, or made a mistake there. But when we have this motion, we oblige the companies to explain the causes and the particular reasons why they hired a particular person, and we make them go into detail. And the person who gets fired, he also sees the details, and he can make some he can make up his mind of why was he fired, where particularly he did a mistake, and that's why he can learn from those mistakes and do not do that in future. Because simply, if he does not understand why particularly he made a mistakes or stuff like that, he can make those mistakes again when he goes to another job, or for example in future, or he can simply blame the company. No, thank you. He can simply blame the company and just into a lot of stress and panic because he does not understand what particular he did wrong, and think just because I was fired because my job was because my boss was evil, or because it's all the fault of the company and not because of me. But when he sees the detailed information on what he did wrong and why particularly he got fired, he can learn from that information. He can learn from these mistakes and do not do them in future. And that's why he will get a more stable job and learn and improve the work he does. And thus he will be less likely to be fired again. And the third point of our case that we have is the recession. Just a little bit later. Instead of well, the recession is a pretty serious point here, is that we understand that simply the economy, instead of growing, it shrinks, and a lot of companies, they run out of money, and their business is going to its end. And in this very case, a very interesting situation happens is that employers, they have to fire people in order to stay in business, in order to save their own money. So they care about their company and they care about their own incomes, and they do not care about what other people, other employers will do when they get fired. And the problem with the recession is that the recessions are short, but they have long-lasting consequences. For example, the one that was brought into 2007 or 8, it took years of recovery because a lot of people, they lost their jobs and they didn't have the opportunity to find something more. And thus a lot of people gets unemployed, not because of their particular reasons, because they did something wrong, but because their employers, they pursue their own benefits. And that's the problem, because unemployment with people is a very serious thing, because when people lose their job, sometimes it's really difficult for them to find another job. For example, if it's something rare, or for example, if it takes a lot of years to get an advancement, and it also leads to the fact that people will probably suffer more, because even if they find another job, they will lose time, and they will lose a lot of time, and thus a certain period of their time they will just stay without work and don't get any impact, and thus it also requires a lot of stress and a lot of panic and so on. And when we have this motion, simply the employers cannot fire just because they want to save their money. They need particular reasons for this person to be fired, and that's why less people will be unemployed and more people will be happy. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech and would like to invite the member of opposition. Here.
Okay, thank you very much for the previous speaker and the other speakers as well. We would like to start with a little bit rebutting what was just said. Okay, so the previous speaker is saying that these laws are enabling workers because they get protected from companies firing them, and we think this is not true, since in making a hiring decision, a company is assessing a risk. So in a sense, if they know that they will be, they know that they will have less opportunity to fire the people who they employ, they will of course get less employers. And this is hitting the vulnerable people especially. So it's as the government, our job, sometimes in this debate, by the way, the government is characterized kind of as a business, so that it's good for the government if it is having less cost and less need to pay less welfare benefits. This isn't the correct characterization of a government. The job of a government is to protect those who are vulnerable in the society, and these laws are hitting the most vulnerable people in society for the following reason: in ever evolving and because of the ever evolving technology and automation in society that we see that's happening at the fast rate currently in the globalized markets, the companies need to react quickly to the changes in the market. So, for example, many of the jobs that we have currently are becoming redundant because of the automation. For example, there's constantly less jobs available, and in order to even have these companies operating, they need to react quickly to the market changes. And this is clearly these laws that the government is proposing. These are clearly hindering the companies' abilities to react to market changes. And in this sense, that when the companies can't react to the market changes, they will be less likely to hire more people. They are more likely to go bankrupt, to lose the competition in the global market, and this is going to hit the most vulnerable people, as has been characterized already in this debate. But we explain why this is happening. And as I said already, as government, as policymakers, to put it better, our job is to protect the vulnerable people. Furthermore, what hasn't been discussed in this debate, but this is crucially important, or it has been discussed to some extent by the opening opposition, is the sort of the larger economic impact of these laws and the larger social impact. So when the opening opposition characterized the situation in an economic crisis in a way that it's the companies, it will be bad for the companies and the economic as a whole, but they didn't, if these laws are enacted, but they didn't explain really why, and we do that. So similarly to the reasons that I just explained, companies in economic downturn, it's absolutely crucially important that companies have the chance to react quickly to the changes in the market. So, in a crisis, they need to cut their costs. Otherwise, in globalized markets, they will be very quickly losing the competition against other companies who are reacting quickly. And if we enact this kind of laws, it means that in an economic crisis where already people are getting fired, that's a fact, and there will be more employment. If we enact these laws, in addition to having more unemployment and more burden on the government, as in welfare costs, there will be the effect of having companies going bankrupt in an economic downturn because of these hindering laws. And what this then creates, the economic downturn, the crisis will be much more deeper and severe as compared to the case where we don't have these laws and where the companies can react quickly to the changes in the market, and when they can cut costs as they need. And then what this then what this means in the longer term is that companies can survive from the economic downturn more quickly, and then again start hiring more people, which is, you know, good for the people, good for the company, and good for the government as well. That is the most pivotal point in this debate, that we need a fit companies that can react quickly to the market changes, not kind of companies and legislation like we had in the 90s in Finland, where we had an economic downturn in this country because of the fall of the Soviet Union. The companies, plenty of companies went into lost their market because of the fall of the Soviet Union, and they couldn't fire people because of the rigid rigid laws on firing people, and many companies went bankrupt. It meant that for a generation, the consumption of alcohol went up in Finland because of the large unemployment. This left a mark, a scar on the whole generation in Finland. To finalize, I think this is obviously on our side, this case. So I'm very happy to oppose this case. Thank you very much.
Thank the speaker for their fine speech, and would like to invite the government whip. Here.
Okay, 1 second, please. So before I start, I would like to ask if you have any questions, please, you can turn just the microphone, because if you just try to contact me through the video, I might not be able to see it. So if you have any question, you can just ask it aloud, please. Then I will try to answer it. So let's begin. Let's start from the end of the speech of the closing opposition. You were talking about that companies will be incompetitive due to the changes of markets, etc. But we want to tell that changes of market happen because different companies compete. It's because of competition, because some companies produce more products, and such that leads to the changes in prices, and etc. etc. That's why if we implement this law, it will affect each company, each and every company. Every company will follow the exact same rules. And therefore, some companies will not be more competitive than the others, because every company will just follow the exact same rules. That's why we do not see how it will work and how it will make some employers more incompetitive than the others if they will all be just the same competitive, and there will be just the same factors of competitiveness in your world than in our world. Secondly, that you were talking about technologization. Both oppositions mentioned this point that it will somehow damage technologization and etc. No, we believe that it will never damage technologization, because companies, they will still try to follow this trend, because it is still beneficial for them, even if they cannot fire their workers. And so they will still follow this technologization trend, because it still will be more beneficial. They may fire their workers and pay this severance pays for them still, and it will be still more beneficial than without this technologization. So it will happen. It is unavoidable, and it will happen in any case. And in our world, in the world of government, it is still present, and it will still occur, because companies want to. It's better for them to fire these workers and pay them severance pays in our world. But still, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So I was wondering whether you mentioned that companies are going to pay the workers as well and keep the technologies as well. So I was just wondering how they're going to manage both kind of pays, and how they're going to manage the maintenance fees of the technologies. Remember also that the technology is growing rapidly, and that inevitably outsources or outdates the manual work.
Yeah, I understand. Well, still, technologization is really beneficial for any company, and it will not stop because we implement this law. They will still follow this technologization, and it won't be a problem for them because it's still more beneficial than just keeping the workers just because you do not want to pay them severance payments. It will still be more beneficial to make this technologization and pay these workers the payments because technologization reduces their costs, reduces all the technological process, reduces the cost of this technological process, and etc. So they will still follow this rule, and it will never, the progress will never stop. But in our world, it will still be happening, but workers will feel more confident and will not be left behind when the company makes this progress, because it is not just simply fair if the technologization happened, like in the case of industrial revolution, a lot of workers were losing jobs. That's why it led to a large technological crisis. But however, technologization happened. It will happen anyway, but in our world, these workers will not lose their jobs, or they will receive some extra payments after they have been fired or retired. That's why in our world, that will be more happiness and more people will still have money to live for. And secondly, that in the, what point was talking about opening position is that you will not have individual skills and that it will be more variable in your world. Well, we do not agree, like the opening government had mentioned, there are still big jobs, interviews, and etc. And I have my teammate told as well that it's really, it still provides this competition because you want to enter this job because requirements are higher. That's why you want to fit these requirements. But unlike the opening government, my teammate was talking about the consequences which are happening because of the more selective choice of the companies, because the requirements are higher and it's much harder to get into job. People become more competitive. They study harder. They want to get this job. Even if they get rejected once, they will still try to employ to other jobs and try to enter other jobs and etc. That's why they will study harder. They will try to make their skills perfect. That's why if the company hires some individuals like this who are really competitive and who are really skilled, firstly, we will have more individuals that are skilled in particular field, and secondly, the companies who have hired these individuals are prosperous. That's why it leads to some economical consequences, which only our table was talking about. That's why, yeah, you have a point?
Yeah. So I was going to say that during times of crisis, the companies need to fire because they run the risk of running out of business. So they either have the option of firing some employees and being still in business, or in the end becoming bankrupt, and in the end, actually, in effect, everyone becoming unemployed, all the employees becoming unemployed. So
yeah, my teammate was talking about, yeah, I understand your question. My teammate was talking about recession. This is a period which is much, it will not lead to the crisis because companies will not just fire their workers, because the recessions are really slow, like my teammate have already explained. They will time goes by and this recession pass and still people will have their jobs. But if a lot of people lose their job, it will be a world economic crisis, and not only one company become bankrupt. Even if it happens, it will be just one company. In our case, if there are a lot of unemployed people who suffer to get some jobs, who struggle on the streets and do not have hunger, that will lead to the world economic crisis. And this scenario will happen in any case, but in ours. In our case, we will still leave these individuals a choice. They will leave us with money. And if there is a recession, these people will be able to fix it. Or in the future, they will not have these horrible consequences of an economic crisis. And that's one of the mainest extension of our table. It's about the less likelihood of the crisis, the world crisis. When companies get just scared that they will go bankrupt, they continue firing their workers, and thus leading to the world situation where a lot of workers are fired and people struggle to get jobs. That's why the jobs which companies have left cannot be done by anyone. That's what leads to less product produced, that leads to prices being changed, and etc. And that leads to the economic crisis. Firstly, people suffer more in our world, in your world, because there's more likelihood of crises. And in our world, people will not suffer so much because Therefore, they will have this opportunity to receive these payments, and companies and crisis will not happen. And secondly, it's just a prosperity, and it leaves more what transparency my teammate was talking about, and the less room for speculation. If you are getting fired, you cannot make some bad words about your boss, because you see your mistakes and you can fix them in the future. And secondly, yeah, you cannot say something bad about him and damage his reputation. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech, and would like to invite the last speaker of this debate, opposition whip. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the questions that needs to be asked in this debate is which stakeholder matters the most? There's been a lot of emphasis coming from OG and closing government in regards to like providing this sort of a system in which individuals are incentivized to learn new talents and get better talent inside and giving them feedback if they are fired and such. But all of this sort of presumes that they talk about individuals who have had this opportunity to enter these kind of jobs and who actually have achieved these sort of jobs. So it is not clear that these individuals, when considering the side of the government or the worlds of the government and opposition, how much do these worlds differ for these individuals? It does seem that these individuals do have opportunities on both sides of the house, perhaps a bit less on the side of the opposition, but still they have the opportunities. Thus, we need to ask which are the stakeholders who are the most affected in these sort of worlds. And what we in closing opposition bring this idea that there are these sort of vulnerable populations, which was in part mentioned by the opening opposition. They talk about like different minorities, perhaps people who have gaps in their work histories, other individuals for which it is much harder to achieve these goals, individuals that are perceived to be risky because they perhaps don't know these individuals so well. They might seem alien to them because they don't come from a different cultural background, or they might be seen as lazy if there are job gaps or other. And when the businesses look at these individuals that are who seem risky, we don't actually really care, are they actually risky or not? It is enough for the employers to actually perceive these individuals to be risky, and thus they decide not to hire them. And the problem is that if we impose this sort of a job security legislation, then the economic calculation, as was in part discussed by the government, where they established that now the companies will demand more of these individuals, but if they are already this sort of a risk perceived on them, then the companies are likely to reject these individuals because they are perceived as more risky and they don't like to make the investment in this case. And thus that is a problem of depriving these individuals opportunities that they have on the side of the opposition, because now the companies can say, okay, they might be a bit risky, but if that risk materializes, then we can just fire the individual. Whereas on the side of government, they might say, we don't even want to hire them because the risk is just too hard, because you have to then pay later on. And thus these individuals don't have these opportunities on the side government. Now, one other question which is important is the context that leads to unemployment and how relevant it is. A lot of sides talk about economic downturns and crises, but what we establish in closing opposition, that these are actually more frequent and are fundamentally related to the current form of industry. We talk about technological innovation, technological revolution, which replaces old forms of jobs, some sort of, let's say, more menial tasks, which can later be automated by systems. And now, from closing government, we get decided that all companies are affected by this legislation, thus there are no, let's say, competitive differences. But obviously, companies' investment in these other forms of things differ. For example, if you have a much more larger company, which has interested a lot of labor in this menial task, and when a smaller company comes and that smaller company innovates and makes the automation or whatever, then this bigger company is actually in a much more worse position because they have now made more investment. And now for them to remain competitive against the smaller company, they would have to fire these individuals. Now, what is the problem in this firing decision? Because this company has provided the opportunities for these individuals. And given that I already explained why certain individuals who would not have had these opportunities on the side government now have these opportunities on the side opposition, well, the decision to fire them, perhaps unfortunate for them, but at least they have gained the experience which provides the foothold for perhaps getting a job elsewhere, an opportunity that they would not have had on the side government. And given that these are the individuals that are most affected by this motion and who don't have the actual and whose opportunities systematically differ from each other, thus this is the main consideration that should be concerned in this debate. And the problem with sort of punishing companies for providing opportunities for individuals, because when you are given a job, that is obviously an opportunity that is being granted to you, which is always better than not having a job in vast majority of cases. And thus having this opportunity to have this job and getting the experience which provides you the basis from which you can form your career later on, this is the important factor which is given in the side opposition and elaborated upon by my partner with regards to the nature of the industry and the actual why are the vulnerable population the most critical stakeholder in this debate. Also, reactions to recessions. Well, when these companies obviously companies don't really hire and fire all willy-nilly because the hiring process still takes some time. They have an incentive to be focused on these hiring procedures. And thus, when they are firing individuals, they usually tend to make them more or less for rational reasons. For example, for the company to be able to sustain the business. And obviously, if the company is unable to sustain the business by making the necessary decisions given by the market, then more individuals will be left unemployed, because if the company goes under, all of the other jobs related to the company also go under, and thus this generates more unemployment. Now, to sum up, the case which the closing opposition does is explains to you why these sort of mechanisms which create unemployment are more frequent than just crises. And we also explain to you why the most vulnerable populations are the most critical stakeholder whose opportunities are most changed, and thus we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thanks, speaker, for their fine speech. Thank you, everyone, for this debate. Now we are going to discuss for 15 minutes, and so please be back in this room in 15 minutes.
I'm going to give you the feedback. If you have any questions, especially if you have personal feedback requests, please leave it until the end so that we can have an individual chat and not everyone has to stay in the call. Okay, thank you for this debate. We had a nice discussion and came to a unanimous call. So the first goes to closing government, second goes to opening opposition, third goes to closing opposition, and fourth, unfortunately, goes to opening government. So I'm going to start chronologically. So from opening government, we get basically three things. First of all, we hear that now the companies will have more qualified people. There will be some additional interviews and because of this, the turnover will, companies are much more likely to find people who is more fitting, who won't leave fast, etc. And then lastly, if you don't have to worry about being fired or whatsoever without severance pay, you will probably be a better worker, and you will have better, you wouldn't necessarily have to be worried about your future. So with regard to those 3 points, I guess the first comment is this following. I guess we need to understand the reasons why there will be more qualified people in this new system. So I need to understand like exactly why this should happen, because it's difficult for me to see the delta from the perspective of employers. Like if I'm already hiring people and interviewing people, I'm already looking for qualified people. I'm already looking for people who wouldn't necessarily leave fast, who is fitting for the company. So I do understand maybe my incentive is bigger now compared to status quo, but I don't understand the extent of it, like why this is such a big delta, such a big difference. I think that needed to be explained. And with regard to the last point, I do agree that you are explaining to me that there are better working people because they don't have to worry, but maybe you can tell me the extent of it, how, like the characterization of it, like how, if I'm have to worry it all the time, how does it impact me, what are the outcomes of it? So I think you could have extended that point. So in response to those, if I have to compare these to the opening oppositions, they have basically 3 points as well. So first of all, they're telling me that, okay, there will be less employment because now there's a lot of burden on the employees to hire people, and they will be much more risk averse. And they're like, they're likely to hire less people to start with because they won't be able to fire them as they wish. So with regard to the first point, I think it does tackles some of the opening government's points with regards to the how, if we are having a better environment for the workers or not, and why it is a problematic thing for put onto the employees such, which in turn then creates less flexibility for the employers. And then because of this, some of the minorities are basically being harmed because the employees are much more risk averse. So with regards to that, it seems to me that there's a bigger harm being explained in terms of the job market and in terms of some specific groups. So opening government, unfortunately, does not respond to these points directly, but rather just talk about how there still will be competition in the beginning of the interview process, and because of this, you will probably going to have still good quality amount of people, and they will still keep working. But this doesn't necessarily answer to the main point of opening opposition, which is that the companies will probably suffer and they won't be able to get out of crisis or when things change. And because of this, there will be much more unemployment, and because of that, people are going to suffer. So because of this, opening opposition wins over opening government. However, before I continue, I just want to add another comment with regards to opening opposition, which will be relevant when we're comparing them to the closing half. So the opening opposition's delta, meaning how there will be less employment in this new world, need to be, I think, explained more truly in order for it to be stay in the debate in a stronger level. What do I mean by that? I mean the following. So I need to understand how employers' incentive changes so significantly that there will be such a huge level of unemployment. Because when closing government comes up and tells me, look, in order to do a job, you need certain level amount of people. So it doesn't realistically tell me that there will be such a huge unemployment because you need to hire people, right? In order to produce those goods, whatever. So I think this is really questioning the initial premise of opening opposition, because the rest of the case depends on that analysis, right? Like the minorities will be harmed, or there will be, the companies will be much more at risk in terms of bankruptcy, etc. This all stems from the fact that, okay, I won't be able to be flexible and hire and fire as much as people, and people who will be harmed, the minorities will be harmed because they are the most risky group. But this relies on the assumption that there will be less employment, right? So that needs to be proven. And when the closing government tackles this initial assumption where your case rests upon, then it becomes much more difficult for me to basically compare you in a higher level compared to closing government. Moreover, I think closing government does the following very well. The first is obviously attacking the main principle of the opening opposition's case. However, I would like to hear probably more about this. More examples or more characterizations would have helped to be that stronger, but regardless, I think that's a valid objection. Following these objections, they tell us 3 more things. First of all, how it won't necessarily impact competition with regards to the companies, because this is a policy that everyone has to do. So here, closing opposition provides an objection by comparing small and big companies in terms of different requirements. However, I'm not sure, like it felt like an exception rather than a general case. So I guess I needed to hear more about this in order to believe that to be true. Further on, closing government tells me that, look, there will be more transparency with regards to how managers, for example, decide to fire a certain person, etc., in terms of performance reviews, rather than making it more arbitrary. So I think this point shows us that probably with regards to the unemployment, closing government is still protecting a lot of people, because now they know that they need to, they won't be able to be without job if there is no real, very serious reason. And lastly, they talk about basically how recession harms people, and why, especially in those times, you need to keep people working. So here, I think I needed to hear also a bit more. It would have been nicer to hear a bit more on this. What could be the alternative things, for example, can be done by companies rather than firing people, and why companies don't do that in the status quo. So you could have talked about further about this. However, these points seem to be well explained within the context of debate, and given that it answers directly to opening opposition and also fills some of the basically issues that opening government left, closing government places above those 2 opening themes. Now, I already mentioned closing opposition briefly, but now bringing them into this comparison directly. So the closing opposition brings us basically 2 main things. One is that how companies cannot react to changes very flexibly. They give the example of like automation, etc. So this is a very interesting point. However, it's a point that opening opposition already brings to the debate. I do accept the fact that you guys are giving more examples and giving it maybe a better characterization. So we do credit you for that. However, it is unclear the extent of the impact you are adding on top of the opening opposition. Therefore, I'm not sure if it's if it's not necessarily a point that you are getting over opening opposition. The other thing that closing opposition brings is this whole basically actor analysis, diving deep dive into this minority students or all these vulnerable groups that were mentioned in the debate. So again, I think opening opposition does mention that. They do talk about how they are seen more risky, and because of this, they're less likely to be hired in the first place. So again, here, not sure of the extent of the additional impact. However, I think what you guys are doing very well is show me that why I have to care about these actors. So you are adding additional analysis that these vulnerable people need to be prioritized somehow. And because of that, we did credit you, and we did find those analysis to be relevant to the debate. However, we don't think it necessarily answers to the points that brought up by the closing government, and it doesn't necessarily add so much to so much more analysis compared to opening opposition. Therefore, that needs they fall below those 2 teams. And compared to opening government, we see that, well, giving at the end of the debate, the things that they're explaining are more on the side of like better working conditions or better feeling about your working. And compared to that, closing opposition tells us how this won't necessarily be the case, and how there are actually more opportunities necessarily once you are in the job market thanks to this. I think it's more likely to answer to opening government's case than their case answering to closing opposition. So because of that, we see that closing opposition above opening government. So does that make sense so far? So are there any
can
questions?
we ask questions?
Yes, sure. Before that, I just want to tell a bit more in general, like for everyone, general feedback for everyone. how could you make this debate or arguments better? And then this will take like 2-3 minutes, and then you can ask questions. So the first thing is, I think in order for your speeches, and this applies to everyone, by the way, in order for your speeches to be better, I think you need to consider 3 things. So the one is that, obviously, what is going to happen once you pass this policy, right? Like, you are always asking this first question, which is fine, but you need to ask the following 3 sub-questions. Like, what is the initial premise your argument hinges on? As I already, for example, explained in the opening opposition's case, there is an initial premise, and the following arguments are reliant on that. So make sure you're basically proving your initial premise very well. Otherwise, once a team attacks your initial premise, the rest of the case is much likely to fall, or much easier to be attacked. The second thing is, I would like you to answer, is how likely it is to happen. So even though there might be competing things happening with the same policy, one could be more likely to happen than the other. So here, I think you need to explain to me how realistic, how likely that is to happen. And you can do that, by trying to generalize certain concepts. You can tell me why, for example, employment costs is the biggest cost, and that's why companies need to cut that first, why other costs cannot be cut. You know what I mean? Like, try to make your case more dimensional and explain to me how they are likely to happen. And the last thing that needs to be done is that compare to all the other things that is going to happen, because clearly you can accept the fact that government is going to tell certain things that's going to happen, and opposition is going to tell certain things that's going to happen. And they both could happen, but why do I have to care one over the another? This needs to be explained. So I think closing opposition try to do that by telling me, like, why do we need to care about these actors, which stakeholders matters the most, etc. But this doesn't have to just rely on the stakeholder analysis. You can also tell me within the arguments, look, this impact is the most important one, here are the reasons for that. So that's the first point. The second point is, what is the principle behind this? So why do I care about some actors more than the other, for example? So here, basically, some teams will be prioritizing employers, and some teams will be prioritizing employees. But what is the principle behind this? Like, why in a state it's more okay to prioritize one over the other? And here you can say, look, business is more important, or you can say, look, citizens or employers are more important, and here are the reasons. There could be some principle justifications, right? Some countries, for example, have really high protections for workers, and they're more, for example, social democratic countries whatsoever, compared to some countries who are more neoliberal, and it's much easier for workers to be fired, and they don't have as many rights, unions, etc. So here you can compare, for example, Germany versus United States, right? So, but there are some principle and philosophical reasons for this difference as well. You can also talk about this. So just to give you an idea of additional arguments, especially in the closing themes. And lastly, in order for your analysis to be better, try to be more down to earth. So this is something that is really crucial for me. And also I know that a lot of the people in the Euros, CA team, etc., many judges really care about this. The fact that how realistic your analysis is. And in order to make sure this is happening, try to answer the following questions in your head. Like, how does it change the day-to-day work, for example? How does it change the incentives of managers? How does it change the international business? So now that I know in my country that I have to apply this policies, does that mean I have more incentives to go abroad, try to find countries where there are no these labor restrictions? What does that mean? For example, just to give you an example of these. So try to imagine yourself in the shoes of these people running companies, and imagine how it would look like, or how it would change your operations. Okay, that's it. Does that make sense?
Yes,
So you can ask questions now.
Much.
Yes, thanks a lot.
For there are no individual scores apart from your team score, so I have not given speaker points. but I'm more than happy to give you individual feedback if you just stay in this chat. So people who don't need any feedback, they can leave if they want.
Okay, thanks guys. Lots for the debate. I'm gonna have to go, so hope you see some